The sea air tasted different when you owned the house. That's the thought that crossed my mind as I stepped out of the cab and looked up at the pale stucco building with white shutters and a wraparound porch. The sound of waves lapping the shore carried on the breeze, light and indifferent. I tightened my grip on the handle of my small rolling suitcase. My other hand held the keys warm from my palm, heavier than they looked. Claire stood frozen on the front steps. Her smile, already brittle from the surprise of seeing me, cracked entirely when her gaze landed on the keys. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice low but sharp, the kind of tone she used when she didn't want her in-laws to hear. I gave a small, polite smile. "Good morning, Claire." Behind her, the murmur of conversation and clinking glass drifted out from the house. I saw movement through the wide windows. Her husband Kevin's family, all dressed in breezy linen and pastel polo shirts, their voices laced with the kind of confidence that money accumulates over generations. Claire stepped forward, blocking my view with her shoulder. I didn't know you were coming. This weekend is for Kevin's family. Our anniversary." "I know." I nodded slowly. "That's what your post said." She blinked, color rising in her cheeks. "You saw that?" I glanced down at the welcome mat that read, "This must be the place." I'd always liked that phrase. It felt like a promise. "Yes," I said, though I would have appreciated a call. "Mum," she hissed. This wasn't meant for you." "Nobody invited you." Behind her, a man in a salmon-colored shirt chuckled loudly from the living room. Claire flinched, as if the sound confirmed just how much I didn't belong here. I slid the key into the lock. Claire reached forward. "What are you doing?" "I thought I'd come early," I said, opening the door. "Make sure everything was in order before your guests got settled." She stared. "You have a key." I stepped into the house, taking in the open-plan kitchen, with its quartz countertops and the long tables set for 12. A white rose centerpiece sat in the middle, flanked by wine glasses so delicate they looked like they'd shatter at a sneeze. My gaze traveled up to the chandelier above, rustic bronze with faux candles. The exact one I had picked from the catalogue. Claire didn't follow me inside right away. Her heels clicked hesitantly on the hardwood as she crossed the threshold, closing the door behind her. "How do you have a key?" she repeated, voice shaking now. I turned slowly. "I bought the property last month." Her mouth opened, then closed. "You're renting it through Seaglass Coastal Management," I said, pausing to set my suitcase by the staircase. "That's my LLC. I thought it would be perfect for family gatherings." Claire's mouth finally found the strength to move. "You bought this house?" "Yes, but why?" Her voice broke on the word, like it had never occurred to her that I might own something she didn't know about, that I might be capable of something this inconvenient. The truth was simple, and long and painful, but in that moment I capped it to a sentence. "I thought it would be nice to have a place by the sea." Footsteps approached from the hallway. Kevin's mother, Lenora, appeared with a mimosa in hand and a coral shawl draped around her shoulders. She stopped short when she saw me. "Oh," she said, blinking behind tortoiseshell sunglasses. "Barbara, I didn't know you were coming." "Apparently, nobody did," I replied gently. Claire stepped in front of me, offering her best tight-lipped smile. Mom was just leaving. She must have gotten confused. I raised my eyebrows but said nothing. Lenora looked between us, sensing something deeper, something awkward. "Well, I hope everything is okay." "Of course," I said, smiling with the kind of ease you earn over years of being underestimated. Claire walked me toward the side hallway, lowering her voice to a whisper as we moved. "You can't stay here." "I can and I will," I said, not unkindly. "Your guests are welcome to enjoy the home." I won't disturb the schedule. It's already been paid for. That's not the point. I know. She stopped. Her hands clenched at her sides. This is our weekend. Kevin's whole family is here. You showing up like this? Like what? I asked, tilting my head. Uninvited? She swallowed hard. It's embarrassing. There it was. The word. Not hurtful by itself, but sharp enough in her mouth to draw blood. I understand, I said after a long pause. I'll stay out of your way. But I won't leave. This is my home. For now, at least. Claire stared at me for a moment longer. Before retreating down the hall, I made my way upstairs, trailing my suitcase behind me. The guest room had tall windows that opened onto a view of the water, where pale umbrellas dotted the shore like delicate mushrooms. I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the sound of the ocean fill the silence. Claire had left behind Dot in the corner. A welcome basket sat with a note in polished calligraphy. Thank you for choosing Sea Glass Coastal. May your stay be restful and full of joy. I almost laughed. I had signed off on that message just 2 weeks ago, when the basket company asked if I wanted to personalize the cards. I stood and walked to the window. Claire's voice echoed faintly from below forced cheer. Brittle laughter. The woman who once wore a homemade tutu at her 2nd grade recital now scrambled to explain her mother's presence to a table full of country club regulars. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt tired, but I also felt certain that I'd stopped. Asking for a seat at tables where my chair was already being dragged away. I turned from the window, unpacked my suitcase slowly, and placed a worn paperback on the knitstand. Then I removed the photo of Claire at her college graduation me in the background, eyes beaming, and set it beside the lamp. She hadn't remembered me this weekend, but I remembered everything. The next morning, I woke to the muffled sounds of clinking dishes and voices drifting up from the kitchen. Someone was making a smoothie, probably. Claire's father-in-law, the one with too much enthusiasm for kale. For a moment I lay still, watching the morning light press through the gauzy white curtains. The beach beyond the window shimmered. With a new tide, soft and steady, I rose without hurry, brushing my hands over the quilt someone had folded at the foot of the bed before my arrival. A small, kind gesture from the cleaning crew. I made the bed properly hospital corners, fluffed pillows, and placed the paperback back into my satchel. Then I slipped on a pair of soft-soled shoes and opened the door to face the day. The hallway was empty. Just silence, sea salt in the air, and the smell of lemon furniture polish. I moved carefully down the staircase, listening for voices. Claire saw me first. She was at the espresso machine, in one of those pale blue linen sets she favored, now clothes that looked both expensive and effortless, though I knew from years of laundry that such fabrics were rarely either. Her smile was quick and stiff. Good morning, Mom. Good morning, Claire, I said. The kitchen had filled up. Kevin stood at the stove, flipping pancakes. His younger brother poured juice. Their mother, Lenora, was arranging a plate of fresh fruit. I noticed that the chairs at the long dining table had already been claimed cardigans draped, sunglasses tucked on seatbacks. I didn't mind. I wasn't looking for a seat. I simply walked toward the end of the counter and reached for a clean mug. Lenora smiled faintly. Did you sleep well, Barbara? Very well, thank you. Kevin didn't turn. Coffee's fresh. I nodded. I'll make tea. Claire's voice followed me as I reached for the kettle. We're heading out after breakfast. The guys are golfing, and the rest of us are doing the winery tour. Reservations at 10. How nice, I replied. There was a beat of silence before she added, We won't be back till dinner. I stirred a teaspoon of honey into my tea and looked out the window over the sink. Pelicans skimmed the ocean's surface, wings spread like slow oars. I'll be here when you return. Claire turned to the others and began passing out plates. I took my tea to the back patio. It was quiet out there, except for the hum of bees around the hydrangeas. I sat in one of the rocking chairs facing the dunes and sipped slowly, the ceramic mug warming my hands. They hadn't invited me, and now they didn't quite know what to do with me. I didn't blame them for being disoriented. I had upended their assumptions, and people cling tightly to the things they think they know. After a while, the screen door creaked open. Claire stepped out. She crossed her arms and leaned against the railing, her hair catching the sunlight. For a few seconds she said nothing. "I just wish you had told me," she said finally. "About the house. The rental. All of it." I looked up at her. "Would it have changed how you invited me?" She didn't answer. She watched the ocean instead. I let the silence stretch until it frayed. Then said, "I didn't buy it to make a point. Not at first." "Then why?" I set the cup down. "Because I was tired of watching life pass through the windows of other people's plans. Because I wanted a place of my own. Something not borrowed or tolerated. A home, even if only part-time, where no one could decide whether I belonged." Claire exhaled, slow and shaky. "You still should have told me." I smiled softly. "Yes, but you might have tried to stop me. And I needed to do something that wasn't about permission." She looked away again, fingers tightening on the railing. "I know I'm not what your world expects," I said. "I know I don't dress the part or say the right things at your in-laws' cocktail parties. But I built a life, Claire. A good one. And somewhere along the way, I think you started seeing me as someone you had to explain. That's not fair." "No," I agreed. "It isn't." From inside, someone called her name. Claire pushed off the railing and turned toward the door. "I'll see you tonight," she said, the words flat and rehearsed. I nodded. "Enjoy the winery." She left without looking back. That afternoon, while they were gone, I moved through the house like a quiet caretaker. I made myself a simple lunch and ate it on the porch swing. I wiped down the patio table after the wind knocked over a vase of flowers. I walked down to the beach and stood with my feet in the surf for a long time, letting the tide pull foam around my ankles. No one looked at me strangely. No one called me out of place. When I returned, I found the binder. It had been left on the hallway table beside a guidebook for local attractions and a stack of brochures. I recognized it immediately. Sea Glass Coastal Rental Operations Manual. My name, initials BSC, were printed discreetly on the inside flap. I flipped through the pages, checking maintenance schedules and emergency contacts. Each detail had my hand. In it, the custom scent and the welcome baskets. Mine, the towel sets, chosen for their softness. Even the books on the shelf, copies of classic novels, some with my underlining, had been placed intentionally. It was in every corner a home. I had curated for strangers, for family, for myself. I closed the binder and walked upstairs. The sun was beginning to set when I reached the top landing. I stopped for a moment and leaned on the banister, watching the golden light spill through the hallway like liquid peace. The voices downstairs were absent. The house, for once, was only mine. In that stillness, I finally allowed the smallest ache to surface. Not because they hadn't invited me, but because for the first time, I had stopped waiting to be invited. The storm rolled in around midnight, unnoticed at first. Just a slight pressure drop, the soft whine of wind between the porch railings. I had been asleep for a couple of hours when the rain began. Gentle at first, then more insistent, tapping the roof like distant footsteps. I rose and moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain. The sea had vanished into shadow, and the distant lights of the neighboring houses blurred beneath streaks of water. Thunder rumbled, low and steady. like a warning too tired to raise its voice. I watched for a long while, arms crossed against the coolness creeping into the room. Weather like this used to frighten Claire. When she was little, she'd sneak into my bed with her stuffed turtle and curl against me, whispering, "The clouds are fighting again." I'd hum until she slept, fingers tracing slow circles across her back. That was a lifetime ago. I made tea downstairs and sat by the sliding glass doors, watching the lightning lift the sky in flashes. The rental brochure called this place the Drift House, a name meant to evoke calm and coastlines. But in the dark, with wind rattling the glass, it felt less like a retreat and more like a reckoning. The storm passed by morning, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean. Sunlight spilled across the floors again, and the scent of damp earth filtered in through the patio screen. I spent the early hours walking the beach. The sand was still wet and firm beneath my shoes, strewn with broken shells, and fronds of seaweed tossed inland by the tide. I gathered a few pieces of driftwood and tucked them under my arm. One looked like a curled hand, another like a twisted question mark. When I returned, the others had come back from their excursions. I heard them before I saw them. Kevin's low voice, Lenora's short laugh, someone setting down glasses in the kitchen. The energy in the house had changed. Less vacation, more unease. Perhaps Claire had said something. Perhaps they'd started putting the pieces together. I didn't go into the kitchen. I took the back stairs up to my room and laid the driftwood on the windowsill. Each piece reminded me of something different. One looked like a branch reaching back to where it had come from. Another, brittle and pale, resembled the spine of a fish delicate. Exposed. There was a knock at the door just before noon. Claire didn't wait for permission. She stepped in, barefoot, her eyes swollen and tired. The kind of fatigue that comes not from physical exertion, but from too much pretending. "I need to ask you something," she said. I gestured to the armchair across from the window. "Go ahead." She sat, folding her arms across her chest the way she used to in high school when she didn't want to cry. "How long have you had this money?" I tilted my head. "Which money?" Her jaw tensed. "You know what I mean. The real estate. The LLC. The pen name." So she'd found out. Probably last night while I was sleeping, or this morning while. She searched for some scrap of familiarity in a house no longer hers. "Years," I said quietly. "Longer than you'd guess." She looked at me like she didn't know who I was. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she only ever knew the version of me that stood on the sidelines, wallet open, voice soft. "Why didn't you say anything?" I took a breath, choosing my words with care. "Because you stopped listening." Claire blinked. Her lower lip trembled slightly, but she pressed it firm. "I never meant," she began, but stopped. "I just didn't think that I could build something without help." I asked. "That I might have my own story, separate from yours." She looked down. "You always made everything seem so small, so manageable. I thought you lived modestly because you had to." "I did once," I said. "But later it became a choice. There's a difference between quiet and powerless, Claire." Silence bloomed between us. "I told Kevin's family you were struggling," she said eventually. "That you'd been helping us too much. That's why they gave us money. That's why we got this weekend in the first place." I didn't flinch. "I didn't mean to lie," she added quickly. "Not at first. They assumed things, and I didn't correct them. And after a while, it became easier to keep it going than to explain." I studied her face. My daughter. My blood. And yet here we were, two women separated by stories. We'd told to survive the world. "I wanted you to be proud of me," she said, her voice cracking. But I wanted them to be proud of me too. And somehow, you didn't fit into that. It was a confession. A raw one. I could have snapped. I could have listed every gift, every hour, every choice I'd made to give her a future. But I didn't. Because what would it serve now, except to widen the gap between us? You wanted to belong, I said softly. So did I. She looked up, startled. You? I wanted to belong in your life, I said. Not as someone you had to make excuses for, but as a person. A mother who loved you. Yes, but also a woman who lived. Claire's eyes filled, but she didn't cry. I didn't know how to include you, she whispered. I know. We sat in silence a while longer, each of us trying to understand what the other had become. Eventually, Claire stood. Are you going to tell them? I didn't need to ask who. Kevin's family. The ones who still thought I was a relic. A charity case with good manners. No, I said. They'll find out when it matters. She hesitated at the door. Thank you for not shaming me. I smiled faintly. I don't need to. The truth takes care of that. She opened the door, then paused. Do you still write? Books, I mean. Every day. Her smile flickered. Real this time. Maybe I could read one. Maybe. She left, and I sat. There alone again, but not as alone as before. Outside, the wind had returned, not wild like the night before, just enough to lift the edge of the curtains. The sea had calmed, but change, I knew, always came in tides. The next morning began with an apology that wasn't an apology. I was stirring oats on the stove, early as always, before the rest of the house rose. I brought my own cinnamon from home, a small, labelled jar I kept in my overnight bag out of habit, and was humming softly when I heard the creak of the stairs behind me. Claire's voice, quiet but rehearsed, broke the hush. Smells like... I didn't turn. It always did. She stepped further into the kitchen and leaned against the island, arms crossed, wearing one of Kevin's sweatshirts with the sleeves bunched at her elbows. I told Kevin, she said, just the basics. The LLC. That you own the house. I nodded and spooned oatmeal into 2 bowls, setting them on the counter without fanfare. Did you also tell him how you explained me to his family? She flinched. Some of it. We ate in silence for several minutes, the only sounds the occasional clink of metal on ceramic and the gulls outside, crying over the surf. I meant what I said yesterday, Claire added. I really didn't know. About your books, the money, any of it. I took a sip of tea. You didn't want to know. That stopped her. It was easier to keep me in a smaller story, I said, looking at her now. Easier to frame me as background than to face the possibility I might be more. Claire stirred her oatmeal with a slow, distracted motion. You're right. It was not an admission I expected. Her gaze dropped to the countertop. I kept telling myself I was protecting you from their judgment, she continued. But maybe I was protecting myself from the discomfort of their questions, and from your answer. I set my spoon down gently. What do you want now? Claire blinked. I don't know. To start over. A soft laugh escaped me, not cruel, but tired. I'm not a deck of cards, Claire. I don't shuffle that easily. Her eyes welled up but didn't spill. I know. We finished breakfast without more words. She rose to rinse her bowl, then paused at the sink. Would you want to come to dinner tonight? Just you and me? I raised an eyebrow. Here? No. Somewhere in town. Casual. I considered it. That depends. On what? Whether you want to be seen with me or heard by me. She didn't respond right away. Then softly, "Both." I gave a small nod. "All right." She left the kitchen with a whisper of socks on tile. Later that morning, I wandered into town alone. The breeze was warmer than the day before, and the sidewalks had dried after the storm. Shops had propped open their doors. Salt air mixed with the smell of espresso and sunscreen. I found a small bookstore tucked between a gelato shop and a surfwear outlet, with a faded sign that read Anchor and Quill. The inside smelled of old pages and pine cleaner. A grey cat slept near the cash register, curled on a copy of Great Expectations. I scanned the fiction shelves and found, tucked in, the local authors section, one of my paperbacks. Tied Between Us by B.A. Sterling. 4th printing. I touched the spine, but didn't pick it up. The owner, a woman maybe 10 years younger than me with cropped auburn hair and a generous smile, looked up from her stool. "Looking for something in particular?" "Just browsing," I said. "Oh, it's always strange seeing your name on a shelf when no one knows it belongs to you." She tilted her head. "You're B.A. Sterling." I gave a small nod. She stood, eyes wide, then grinned. "I sell out of your paperbacks every summer. Half the women around here think you're a pseudonym for someone famous." "In a way," I said. "I suppose I am." She laughed, warm and unfiltered. "Well, consider this your home base anytime. You want to do a signing, you let me know." I smiled. "Thank you. I might take you up on that." I bought a small leather notebook and a pen, nothing extravagant. Just something new to write in, something clean. As I left, she waved and said, "Don't be a stranger, Miss Sterling." The words followed me down the sidewalk. For so long I had been the familiar ghost at family gatherings. Present, helpful, quietly forgotten. But here, in this strange seaside town, I was someone people wanted to know. When I returned to the house, the driveway was empty. I took the opportunity to sit on the upstairs balcony with the notebook open and the pen resting on my lap. Below, the ocean rolled in and out like breath. The wind carried the sound of children playing further down the beach. I wrote the first line without overthinking it. The mistake wasn't in being quiet. It was in letting others mistake my quiet for consent. Then I kept writing. Not a memoir, not yet. Just fragments. Moments. The time Claire broke her arm on the monkey bars and I carried her half a mile home, sobbing and muddy. The first royalty check that didn't bounce. The way Gerald, my late husband, used to kiss the top of my head whenever I proofread his grad school essays. Stories that no one had asked for, but that still mattered. I stopped only when I heard the car doors slam in the driveway. Laughter followed, Lenora's sharp and high-pitched. Kevin's lower, tired. Claire's voice was quieter, almost hesitant. I closed the notebook, not hiding it, just finishing for now. As I stood, a gust of wind lifted a small piece of driftwood from the windowsill and carried it to the floor. I picked it up and turned it in my hands. It had dried completely, light and hollow. It looked like something that had once tried to hold shape against a storm and failed, but beautifully. That evening I changed into a navy skirt and a simple blouse, pinned a brooch to my cardigan, and tied my hair back into its usual bun. At the mirror, I caught myself pausing, then gave a small, quiet nod. I looked like myself again. We chose a quiet seafood place on the bay, Claire's suggestion. It was the sort of place that didn't try to impress you with presentation, but earned your trust with salt, butter, and history. The wooden floors creaked under every step, and mismatched chairs wobbled slightly under the weight of decades. I liked it instantly. We were seated by the window. The water dark beyond the glass, silver-edged with moonlight. A storm lantern hung above our table, casting warm shadows that shifted as the wind moved outside. Claire hadn't spoken since we left the house. She'd driven with her eyes fixed ahead, hands gripping the wheel tightly, even though there was hardly any traffic. She hadn't even touched the radio. Now, in the flickering light, she looked more like the girl I remembered, not the polished woman with corporate manners and calculated smiles, but someone undone at the seams, unsure whether to stitch them back together or let them fray. "They've all been asking questions," she said finally, folding her napkin with slow precision. "Your in-laws?" She nodded. "Kevin's mother, mostly. She keeps saying she's concerned that I didn't know you were doing so well. She asked if we'd been distant." I sipped my water. "What did you tell her? That we were private?" She let out a small breath, which is only half a lie. The waitress came, cheerful and quick, taking our orders with the briskness of someone who knew how to leave space. Once she was gone, the silence fell again, but it was a different kind now. Not the kind that hides shame. The kind that invites reckoning. Claire traced her fingertip along a faint scratch in the table. "When did the writing take off?" "I published the first novel the year after your father left." She looked up sharply. "I was 12. Yes. You were busy growing up, and I was busy figuring out how to survive. Why didn't you tell me?" I leaned back slightly. "At first, I didn't know if it would work. And later, I didn't want you to think I needed praise or permission. The books were mine, not something I had to justify." Claire nodded slowly. "You always seemed content, but I guess I thought that meant you had no ambition." I didn't reply. There wasn't a response that didn't feel like a wound. Reopened. She caught herself. "That sounds awful." "It sounds honest. I didn't mean it as a judgment. Just," she paused, searching for the right word. "Misunderstanding. Misunderstandings become stories," I said. "And stories become truths if they're told often enough." She lowered her eyes. Our food arrived, breaking the tension briefly. I watched her tuck her hair behind her ear, the way she used to when she was nervous before dance recitals. Back then, I would whisper to her backstage, "They don't know. Your steps, sweetheart. Just dance." I wondered when I'd stopped whispering those things to myself. Halfway through the meal, Claire said, "Kevin's father asked if we'd ever offered to help you financially." I didn't know what to say. "That's because you haven't." She didn't argue. "I didn't need help," I added. "I needed to be seen." Claire set down her fork. "You deserved that. I just didn't know how to make space for you in the life I was building." I looked out at the bay, at the lights, bobbing gently across the water. Sometimes the space is already there. You just pretended it wasn't. We finished dinner with quiet bites and small glances. The weight of too much unsaid had finally begun to shift. Not disappear, just move slightly, as if making room for something else. After the check was paid, Claire lingered near the hostess stand. "Do you want to walk a bit?" she asked. "It's not late." We walked the wooden boardwalk behind. The restaurant, heels clicking in rhythm, the ocean to our right, dark and deep. The air was cooler now. Brine and wood smoke and the faint sweetness of salt water, taffy from a nearby shop that had already closed for the night. Claire broke the silence again. "There's something I should tell you." I glanced at her. "The way you do when you know what's coming won't be light." She hesitated. "The rental wasn't a gift from Kevin's parents. Not really. I asked them to cover it. I told them you'd been struggling, that I wanted to give you a break from your small apartment, your routine. I said we needed family time, that they should consider it a favor." I stopped walking. "You used my name to ask for charity." She winced. "I didn't mean it that way. I didn't think you'd ever come. And if you did, I thought I could explain it away." But I didn't expect to walk into the house and see you with keys. I stared out at black water. You turned me into a debt before I ever stepped foot inside. I know, she whispered. And I'm sorry. I'm not angry, I said after a long moment. Not really. I'm disappointed that I let it go on this long. That I allowed myself to be small in your eyes, just because it made your story neater. Claire looked like she might cry again, but she didn't. She just nodded, slow and sharp, as if she were cataloguing every moment to remember later. We returned to the parking lot without another word. She offered to drive me back, and I let her. The ride was quiet, but not cold. When she pulled up to the house, she said, I know it's too soon, but if you ever want to meet for lunch back home, just us, no husbands, no obligations, I'd like that. I opened the door slowly. We'll see. She nodded, and this time didn't press. I stood on the porch until her taillights disappeared. Then I turned the key and stepped back into the house. Into my house and locked the door behind me. There was no satisfaction in being right. Only the quiet comfort of finally having chosen myself. Upstairs, I placed the notebook on the knitstand and wrote a single line. Some homes we build in silence, brick by quiet brick, until one day they open. The door for us. I closed the book and turned off the lamp. The morning after the dinner, the house woke slowly. Downstairs I heard the clatter of mugs and the soft groan of cabinet doors. Someone had put on a kettle, and the faint smell of citrus and toast drifted upward. I sat on the edge of the bed with my feet resting on the cool hardwood, letting the light from the east-facing window stretch across the room in stripes. I wasn't in a hurry to move. For once, I felt no obligation to appear cheerful or ready to smooth things over. I had long ago perfected the art of silent caretaking, folding towels no one noticed, laughing softly when others needed the moment lighter. But today felt different. Like the tide had receded and revealed something I hadn't known was still buried. When I did go downstairs, the kitchen was already half occupied. Kevin stood at the sink, rinsing out the coffee pot, while Claire stood at the counter slicing strawberries. She greeted me with a quick nod, avoiding eye contact. Kevin offered a casual morning, as if everything between us hadn't quietly unraveled the night before. I poured myself a cup of tea and stepped outside without another word. The patio chairs were damp from dew, so I stood for a moment, cradling the mug in my palms. The beach beyond the house was empty. No children building sandcastles. No couples walking hand in hand. Just open sky and a glistening shore. I watched the waves come in steady, as they always did. A kind of quiet. Certainty I hadn't felt in my own family for years. After a few minutes, the sliding door opened behind me. Claire stepped out, carrying a small bowl and a napkin. She offered them wordlessly, and I took the strawberries with a polite thank you. She lingered. They're going out on the boat this afternoon, she said, looking toward the water. Kevin and his family, you're welcome, if you want. I'm fine here. I figured. I tasted the fruit sweet. Slightly overripe. You didn't grow up around people like them, I said gently. But you adjusted quickly. Claire's eyes flicked toward me. You make that sound like a criticism. It's not. Just an observation. We stood side by side for a while, watching the tide drag and recede. The silence between us felt less like distance and more like pause, something transitional. You don't really care what they think, do you? She asked. I care that you thought I did. She didn't reply. She just sat, smoothing the hem of her linen pants with both hands. After a moment, she said, Kevin's parents think I'm fragile. They think I'm married up, that I cling to them for identity. I guess I've tried hard to prove them wrong, and in the process, lost your mother. She looked at me sharply. I was never ashamed of you, she said. But you were afraid I didn't fit your new life, I replied. And so you edited me down to something more manageable. I just wanted peace. And I wanted presence. That stilled her. Those two things, I said quietly, are not mutually exclusive. But you treated them like they were. Claire leaned forward, elbows on knees, eyes on the horizon. I didn't know how to defend you without exposing myself. You shouldn't have needed to defend me at all. She sighed, long and low. I know. The conversation ended there. Not because we were finished, but because the space had shifted again. A rhythm between us, uncertain but starting to form. Later that morning, I wandered the house alone. The others had left for the marina. I heard them pulling out of the driveway, laughing too loudly, like noise could erase what? They'd all suspected for days now that I was not who they had assumed I was. That I had been quietly watching from the sidelines, writing and building and investing, while they filed me away as background dot in the hallway. I passed the linen closet and paused. Something had been left slightly ajar dot inside, tucked between. The extra blankets was a familiar cloth satchel mine. I pulled it out and opened it, surprised to see my older journals stacked inside, along with several unopened letters from my publisher. Carefully sealed. I hadn't put them there, which meant someone else had. Carried the bag to the kitchen table and opened one of the envelopes. The date was from nearly 6 months ago. An offer to adapt one of my novels for a limited series on a streaming platform. A second envelope confirmed the interest, this time with terms and conditions. My hands trembled as I read. This wasn't new information. I'd been aware of the inquiry at the time. What shocked me was that these letters forwarded from my old address had been intercepted, hidden, tucked away without a word. Claire. Not Kevin's family. Not the rental agency. Claire. I stared at the journal on top of the pile. My own handwriting stared back margins full of drafts, notes, and scenes scribbled in half-darkness. They were mine. And yet here they had sat, buried, unread, carefully. I repacked the satchel and carried it back upstairs. I locked the door to the bedroom before I placed it inside the dresser drawer. Beneath a stack of folded sweaters. My trust had boundaries now. Not built from spite, but from awareness. That afternoon, I returned to the balcony with my newer notebook and a fresh pot of tea. I wrote deliberately, sentence by sentence, crafting a new preface. This is not a story about revenge. It is a record of how I learned to stop asking for permission to exist where I already belonged. I stayed in that chair for nearly an hour, the letters resting quietly on the table beside me like unwelcome guests. The wind from the open patio door rustled their corners, as if trying to turn a page I wasn't ready for. I didn't cry. I didn't storm down the hallway looking for answers. What I felt, more than anything, was a settling. The kind that comes when a pattern is finally too clear to ignore. The interception of my mail wasn't about malice, it was about control. Claire had always preferred to manage rather than confront, to curate rather than collaborate. And somewhere, in the softness of my silence, she'd found room to speak over me. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was awake. After closing the letters and slipping them into a drawer, I stepped outside and let the sun warm my face. The house was still empty. Kevin's family had taken the boat out hours earlier, and Claire, I assumed, was with them performing normalcy the way she always did when discomfort grew too obvious to name. I walked the length of the porch slowly, barefoot, the wood warm beneath my soles. From the corner, I retrieved an old broom and began sweeping sand off the deck boards. It was a small act, but it anchored me. Order made space for thought. After lunch, I changed into a soft cotton dress and walked into town. Was no plan, just a pull. My feet led me back to the small bookstore, Anchor and Quill, where the cat was now sprawled across a display table, oblivious to commerce and conflict alike. The woman behind the counter looked up and smiled when she saw me. "Miss Sterling." I offered a quiet nod. "Barbara is fine," she chuckled. "Well then, Barbara. Good to see you again. I was wondering." I stepped closer, lowering my voice slightly. "Do you ever host readings?" Her eyebrows rose. "You want to do a reading?" "Just something small," I said. "I have a short piece nonfiction, mostly reflection. Nothing promotional." She reached for a notepad. "We have a local author night next Friday. Would you be open to that?" I thought for a moment. Then, yes, I would. And just like that, something shifted. Not in the town. Not in the bookstore. But in me. It was the first time I'd asked for a spotlight without apologizing for the shadow it might cast. I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Back at the house, I found my favorite pen and a stack of printed pages I'd packed without. Thinking, essays half written, observations I never meant to show. One, in particular, stood out a piece about the quiet dignity of aging and the myth that wisdom means surrender. I marked the paragraphs I wanted to read. I wrote a few new lines. I practiced aloud in the guest room until the cadence felt like my own voice again, not the flattened tone I used when I thought I was only allowed to narrate, never lead. Around 6, the others returned. I heard the crunch of tires on gravel, the chatter of multiple voices, the sliding of car doors. I stayed upstairs. Claire knocked on my door 20 minutes later. "I brought you something," she said, her voice oddly formal. I opened the door, held out a small white box tied with twine. "Lemon bars," she said. "From that little place near the pier. I remembered you used to love them. Still do." She looked past me into the room, where pages were scattered across the desk. "Working, always." Her mouth opened, then closed again. "You seemed quiet this morning." I was thinking. "About the letters?" I held her gaze. "I found them by accident," she said quickly. "Months ago. They came to the house, and I was going through some mail you'd left. I didn't open them all just enough to see what they were about. You put them in a closet. I didn't know what to do." "That's not true." She lowered her eyes. "You knew exactly what to do," I said. "You just didn't do it." "I thought you'd be overwhelmed," she murmured. "The attention, the business side of things. I thought I was protecting you." "You weren't," I replied. "You were protecting your version of me." Claire stepped back, the box still in her hand. "I'm sorry. I believe you." She nodded once, sharply, as if to contain something before it unraveled. "Next Friday," I said. "I'm doing a reading, in town." Her eyes widened slightly. "A reading?" "Yes. A bookstore event. I'll be sharing something personal." She looked at me carefully. "Do you want me to come?" "I want you to decide for yourself." She handed me the lemon bars and walked away. I didn't follow. That night, I sat on the porch again, wrapped in a shawl, the plate beside me half empty. The lemon was too sweet, the crust a little soft, but it was the first offering she'd made. That wasn't coated in shame or expectation. That mattered. I looked out at the stars, scattered wide across the blackness like pins on a map no one could read. Had my direction. Now it was time to speak. The days after Claire brought the lemon. Bars passed quietly, but not without weight. No outbursts, no tense conversations, just small gestures exchanged like offerings from a once-burned bridge, now cautiously walked upon. On Wednesday morning, I returned to town alone with a tote bag over my shoulder and a purpose in my step. The bookstore owner, Anne, greeted me with a wide smile as I stepped through the door. You still good for Friday? She asked, her hands full with a stack of used poetry anthologies. More than good. She led me to the small back corner of the shop, where a few chairs had been rearranged into a semicircle, and a display table had been cleared. A chalkboard sign rested nearby, waiting to be filled. Do you want to use your pen name or your own name? She asked. I looked at the blank slate, then at her. Barbara, just Barbara. She nodded like she understood exactly what that meant. Back at the house, I settled into a rhythm. In the early mornings, I wrote by the open windows. Midday, I walked the beach alone. Claire remained distant but civil. She didn't ask about the event again, and I didn't offer updates. There was something fragile about the stillness, like we were both waiting to see who we'd be on the other side of the weekend. On Thursday afternoon, I set out extra towels and wiped down the porch railings. It wasn't out of habit, it was a choice. The house felt more like mine with each passing hour. Not just legally, not just on paper, but in the way a space grows around you once you stop shrinking inside it. That evening, I sat with a red pen, reviewing the marked-up copy of my essay. A few phrases I once thought clever now felt evasive. I crossed them out, rewrote others. I wasn't aiming to impress anymore. I wanted truth, and truth rarely needed embellishment. When I finished, I closed the notebook and walked to the hall closet, pulling down a small wooden box I had tucked behind the linens when I first arrived. Inside were photos, old ones. Claire in braces, holding a science fair trophy. Me on a park bench with a paperback, legs crossed, eyes squinting into the sun. Gerald, her father, laughing behind a barbecue grill, a smudge of sauce on his shirt. Hadn't looked at them in years. I spread them across the bed, letting time spill where memory usually stayed sealed. The images weren't perfect. Some were bent, others grainy. But they were real, unfiltered. A life in fragments. Before we edited each other into caricatures. I picked up one photo of Claire, age 9, holding a seashell to her ear. Her expression, caught somewhere between wonder and disbelief. She used to think you could hear the whole ocean that way. And in a way, maybe you could if you believed in it. I placed that photo inside my reading binder, just behind the cover page. A reminder that our stories didn't start in silence, even if they fell into it. Friday morning arrived grey and cool. The kind of weather that asks you to pay attention. I stood on the back porch with a shawl over my shoulders, watching the water rise and fall as the fog shifted along the shore. The event was set for 6 in the evening. Not formal, not advertised beyond the hand-lettered sign Anne had propped in the window. Local author reading. Barbara, 6 p.m. tonight. At 4, I changed into slacks and a soft blouse, layering my floral cardigan over it like armor made of memory and comfort. I tied my hair back, adjusted my glasses, and gathered my materials into the binder as I stepped toward the door. Claire appeared at the base of the stairs. She looked dressed to go somewhere, jeans, sweater, her hair tucked behind her ears, like she hadn't slept well. Do you want a ride? She asked quietly. I plan to walk. It's a long walk, she added. I don't mind the time. She nodded slowly. Then I'll walk with you. We said nothing else as we moved down the driveway together, the gravel crunching softly beneath our shoes. The town wasn't far, but the walk stretched between us like something ceremonial. A procession toward a truth we had both avoided for years. Halfway there, she spoke. I read one of your books. I didn't look at her. Which one? The one with the woman who runs the bakery by the sea. I nodded. Bread and Bone. That was the third. I cried, she said, almost in surprise. It wasn't meant to be sad, she shrugged. It was sad because she let herself go unseen for so long. I stopped then, and so did she. We faced each other beneath a street lamp not yet lit. "You're not invisible anymore," she said. Not to me. It wasn't a declaration. It was a beginning. We walked the rest of the way in silence, and it wasn't heavy this time. At the bookstore, Anne had set out chairs in the rear section. A small group had already gathered, locals, mostly women, a few curious tourists. Claire took a seat near the back. I stood by the table for a moment, then stepped forward. "I'm Barbara," I began. I used to think I needed permission to speak in places where people didn't expect to hear from someone like me. I looked at Claire just once. She didn't flinch. But today I'm here because I stopped waiting to be invited. I came anyway. I thought I would shake standing there, with 20 or so eyes watching me from folding chairs and stools. I expected my voice to betray me, or for the floor to tip slightly under my feet. But none of that happened. The air in the bookstore felt warm, even familiar, thick with paper, ink, and the hum of old stories. I held my binder open and began reading. The piece was titled "What Quiet Builds," and it wasn't about Claire. Not directly. It was about the invisible work of women like me. The ones who paid for dance lessons with freelance checks, who walked around boutiques pretending not to notice how staff glanced at their worn shoes, who showed up to family dinners holding casseroles and foil-covered pans, while others arrived with announcements and expectations. I read slowly, clearly, no theatrics, just the words I had written in the privacy of my evenings, now stepping into air. Some women shout, others endure, but some women build cathedrals from patience, from presence. And one day, they realized they were never standing outside the door. They were the door. There was a long silence when I stopped. Not the awkward kind. The kind that feels like breath held between waves. Then came the applause, gentle at first, then growing. A few people stood. A woman near the front dabbed at her eyes. Someone in the back said, "That was beautiful," as if she were speaking not just to me, but to a version of herself. I closed the binder. Hands steady. Anne gave me a quiet nod from the register. "Thank you, Barbara," she said, voice clear, enough to carry without shouting. We needed that. Claire stayed seated as the others stood and began milling about. Some approached me. Some didn't. One woman asked to take a photo. I allowed it, even smiled for it. Another handed me a worn paperback I had published years ago and asked me to sign it. "I always wondered who you were," she said. I didn't say much in return. Not because I was shy, but because sometimes silence is the best punctuation. Claire waited until most of the chairs were cleared before she came up. She looked pale, but not embarrassed. Just still. "That last line," she said softly. "About the door." I nodded. I never saw it that way. "Most people don't," I replied. "Not until the handle's in their hand." She looked down at her own fingers. "Then, you were magnificent." It felt real when she said it. Not an olive branch. Not performance. Just a daughter seeing something she hadn't wanted to understand until now. "I'm glad you came," I said. "I'm glad I stayed." The bookstore began to empty. Anne thanked us both again and told me the door was always open if I wanted to read again. I told her I'd think about it, but inside I knew I would. On the way home, Claire didn't ask if I wanted to ride. I didn't offer to walk. We just fell into step, side by side, beneath a canopy of soft lamplight and the chirring of crickets hidden in garden beds. Halfway down the sidewalk, she said, "Kevin's family saw your name on the rental paperwork." I waited. They asked questions. I didn't have many answers. And it was the first time I didn't feel the need to defend myself for not knowing something. That surprised me. You always wanted to be composed, I said. I wanted to be respected. We walked a few more steps. You know, she continued, they keep their power by making other people small. Yes, I replied. But you don't have to take that habit with you when you leave the room. She gave a small nod. Do you regret it? She asked after a long pause. Regret what? Letting me back in. I stopped walking. The house was just ahead, porch light glowing like a soft eye, half-littered and waiting. No, I said, but I regret making myself smaller for so long. And I regret that you mistook my silence for emptiness. I don't anymore. We climbed the steps together. I reached the door first. Key in hand. I turned it but didn't open the door. Right away. Claire, I said. She looked up. You asked me once what I wanted from you. Yes. I wanted you to remember who built the ground you're standing on. Not to owe me anything, but not to erase me either. Her face changed, then something softened, something dropped. I do, she said. Now I do. Inside, the house smelled like sea air and leftover coffee. She went to her room. I returned to mine. I didn't unpack the binder. I didn't check my email. I sat at the desk, still in my cardigan and shoes, and stared at the photo of Claire as a child seashell pressed to her ear, hearing something that no one else could. And for the first time in years I felt like she had heard me too. The house was quieter the next morning, not because it was empty, but because something in it had changed. Not the furniture, not the ocean wind pushing through the windows, but the weight in the walls, or maybe the weight I'd been carrying in my own chest. The kind that accumulates after years of being gracious when you should have been clear. Moved through the kitchen at dawn, fingers brushing the edge of the counter as if reacquainting myself with the room. The light came in low through the blinds, casting long golden lines across the tile. Claire hadn't come downstairs yet. But she would. And when she did, I knew something would be different. We were no longer pretending to orbit the same star. She had seen me, not a version I edited for her comfort, but the whole person. The mother, yes, but also the writer. The woman who once fixed a pipe under the sink herself and negotiated with publishers between bus transfers. I poured a cup of tea and carried it to the porch, where I wrapped myself in my cardigan and watched the morning unfold. From across the dunes, I could hear the muffled clatter of activity. Kevin's family packing their things. They were leaving that day, as planned. No one had said goodbye yet, but that too felt expected. Their version of civility was built on polite absences. As I sat watching the waves inch closer to the shore, Claire appeared behind me. A blanket draped over one arm. You're up early, she said. Old habits. She settled into the chair beside me and pulled the blanket over her lap. Her eyes looked clearer than they had all week. They're leaving around 10, she said. Kevin's parents, his brother, all of them. I nodded. I figured. She hesitated before adding, I told them everything. That got my attention. I turned slightly, watching her. Everything? I asked. The truth. About the rental. About the house. About who you really are. I sipped my tea. And how was that received? Claire gave a short laugh. Poorly. I imagine it didn't fit the narrative. No, she said. They didn't like being reminded that money doesn't always come with a last name or a country club membership. Or their approval. She smiled at that. What did Kevin say? I asked. She looked out at the horizon. He was quiet. Then he said he admired you. I raised an eyebrow. That must have hurt. Claire laughed again, softer this time. A little, but I think I needed to hear it. We sat in silence for a long stretch. the ocean filling the space between words. Then she said, I told them we might not come next year. That surprised me. This week was supposed to be about them, she continued. That the only person who actually brought a family together was you, and they treated you like background noise. I let them, I said, for a while. But? Not anymore. No, I agreed, not anymore. She reached into her cardigan pocket and pulled out a small envelope. This came for you, she said. I almost didn't give it to you, but I promised myself I wouldn't filter things anymore. I took it. The return address was from my publisher. I opened it slowly. Inside was a check. A large one. Royalties from overseas sales I hadn't expected. Along with it, a letter inviting me to speak at a women's literary symposium in New York. Claire watched as I read. You're bigger than this beach town, Mum. I like this beach town. That doesn't mean it's the only place you belong. I folded the letter, not ready to answer just yet. The invitation felt like both an acknowledgement and a crossroads. My life was no longer one of quiet anonymity, and the world, if I let it, was starting to knock. You should go, Claire said. Let people hear what I heard last night. I stared down at the letter. I thought of the years I'd spent writing under a pen name, invisible even in the places where I was most seen. I had been afraid that if people knew who I was, they'd see the mess, the tiredness, the parts of motherhood that weren't polished or pretty. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Maybe I will, I said. Claire stood and walked toward the railing. She looked out at the water and said, I want Emma to know you. The real you. I looked at her back. Then don't stand between us. She turned around, her eyes damp. I won't. And I believed her. When she left the porch, I stayed. The tea had gone cold, but I held the cup anyway. The check and letter sat beside me on the table, fluttering gently in the breeze. I didn't need the money, didn't need the invitation. But I needed the clarity, the knowledge that I was no longer trying to be let in. I was simply choosing where I wanted to stand. And sometimes, standing on your own porch, with your own keys and your own name, was more than enough. The house emptied that afternoon. Kevin's family departed without fanfare, no hugs, no thank yous. Just the rhythmic thump of luggage wheels on the walkway, and the sound of CV doors closing in succession. From the upstairs window I watched. Claire helped load the last bag into the trunk. No one looked toward the porch. I didn't wave. It wasn't bitterness that held me back. It was clarity. There are some exits you don't need to decorate. When the cars pulled away, silence returned. In its full, unassuming shape. Not the awkward kind that had settled over dinners and group activities all week, but the honest quiet that follows after something large has broken and been swept away. Claire came inside a few minutes later. Her shoes left small crescents of sand on the floor. She didn't offer excuses for them. She didn't apologize. They're gone, she said, as if I hadn't seen it for myself. I nodded. You okay? She sat on the bench by the front window, elbows on her knees. Strangely, yes. We stayed like that for a while, her looking out, me leaning against the doorframe, both of us absorbing the unfamiliar sense of stillness that had nothing to do with absence and everything to do with peace. I cancelled the dinner reservation, she said after a moment. The one Kevin's parents made for tonight. What will you do instead? She shrugged. I don't know. Maybe just listen to the waves. That felt like progress. I returned to the porch, this time with my notebook. Not the one filled with drafts or essays, but the smaller leather journal I used only when I had something to record that mattered to me. Not the world, not publishers, just me. It was the same journal I used the day I signed the paperwork for the house. The day I took back the story of who I was from people who'd rewritten it without asking, flipped to a blank page and began writing. The difference between being invisible and being still is that one is imposed and the other is chosen. I paused, watching a gull dip low over the dunes before vanishing behind a line of sea oats. Today, I chose. That evening I made dinner. Nothing fancy: roasted vegetables, herbed chicken, a loaf of rosemary bread I'd picked up from the small bakery down the road. I set the table for two, folded cloth napkins, and opened a bottle of white wine I'd been saving. I didn't say it aloud, but I suppose I was offering something, a kind of soft truce wrapped in hospitality. Claire came into the kitchen just as I was lighting the candle. You didn't have to cook, she said. I didn't, I replied. I wanted to. She looked at the table, the small gestures of care that neither of us had named in a long time, and pulled out a chair. Then I'll set aside my guilt and say thank you. Good, I said, sitting. That's all I've ever really needed. We ate slowly, not because the food demanded it, but because conversation had started to feel less like performance and more like presence. I called Emma this morning, Claire said between bites. I looked up. And? I told her you'd bought the house, that you wrote all those books, that you gave a reading. I smiled faintly. How did she respond? She said, Grandma's a boss, Claire said, laughing. Then she asked if she could come visit next time. She's always welcome. Claire's expression softened. She'll love it here. The sand, the porch, the wind chimes. It feels like a place that was waiting for her. It was waiting. For all of us, I said. We just took a while to find it. After dinner, we cleared the table together. No one assigned roles. There was no tension over who did more or less. We simply moved as two people who had both carried too much for too long in different directions. When the dishes were done, I opened the envelope from my publisher again and placed the check in. A small safe I kept beneath the stairwell. Then I returned to the porch. Claire followed with 2 cups of tea. We sat under the early evening sky, the last blush of sunlight fading behind the dunes. The air was cooler now, the kind that signals the end of something, but not in grief, only in rhythm. I think you should go to New York, Claire said suddenly. I turned to her. Do you? Yes. You need to be in the room now, not hiding behind pen names or quiet exits. I'm not hiding anymore, I said. I'm anchoring. She nodded. Even better. We sipped our tea. The silence no longer held hesitation, it held promise. I glanced out toward the sea. You know, I said, there was a moment, years ago, when you told me I wouldn't understand the life you were building. And I believed you. Claire's eyes flicked to mine. But I think, I continued, what you meant was that you didn't want me to be part of it, because part of you still thought I hadn't built anything of my own. She didn't interrupt. She didn't defend herself. I don't think that anymore, she said. I believed her. The wind picked up slightly, rattling the chimes on the eave. Claire stood and leaned against the railing, her figure framed by the last light. She looked out over the beach like someone who had lost and found something in the same breath. You're not just my mother anymore, she said. You're a story I never took the time to read. And now, I'm ready to start from page 1. I woke early the next morning, the air still cool and damp from the ocean's breath. A soft mist had settled across the dunes, veiling the porch and the horizon in the same gentle blur. The house was hushed, not the kind of hush you fear, but the kind you trust, the stillness that follows truth. Claire had already left for a walk, a note on the counter in her neat handwriting. Down by the rocks. Needed space to think. Back soon. See, I smiled when I read it. She used to leave notes like that in high school on the fridge, tucked in my books, scribbled on receipts. always when she needed to retreat, but didn't want to disappear. I brewed coffee instead of tea that morning. Something a little stronger. Something with more bite. After dressing slate skirt, cotton blouse, and my usual cardigan, I walked through the house slowly, pausing at each window. The beach was just beginning to stir. Joggers leaving soft trails in the sand, dogs chasing foam, an older couple gathering shells in silence. It all felt clean. Possible. I had promised myself, years ago, that if I ever got to the point where I wasn't just surviving, but actually living, I would learn how to celebrate quietly, not with applause or spectacle, but with meaningful endings. Clean lines. Clear choices. Today was about one of those choices. Walk to the drawer beneath the staircase. The one where I had placed the publisher's invitation and the royalty. Check and removed a second envelope I had tucked there days earlier. Inside was the revised version of my will. I'd been finalizing it over the last week, speaking quietly with my attorney back home in the evenings while everyone assumed I was simply journaling. The contents were simple. The house would go to a trust for Emma, to be opened when she turned 30. The remainder of my estate, including my book rights, royalties, and investments, would support a literacy foundation for single mothers, especially those starting over later in life. I wasn't writing Claire out. I was simply writing her role. More honestly, a few years ago I would have wept while signing that document, guilt-ridden, full of doubt. But not now. Not after everything. I slipped the envelope into my bag and walked out to the porch. The ocean still hid behind the mist, but the wind had picked up, just enough to move the wind chimes and lift the edge of my cardigan. I sat in the chair closest to the steps and waited, not out of impatience, but because I no longer felt the need to rush anything that mattered. 20 minutes later, Claire returned. Her shoes were wet. Her sweater clung to her arms. She looked like she had walked all the way to the edge of herself and turned back just in time. She handed me a shell-smooth, pale, cracked at one edge. "For your collection," she said simply. I took it. She sat beside me, quiet at first, then said, "I used to be afraid you'd outgrow me." That surprised me. I thought if you ever realized how strong you were, you wouldn't need me anymore. I looked at her then, really looked, and saw not the daughter who had once judged my silence, but the woman who now feared her own. "I never needed to outgrow you," I said. "I just needed space beside you." She nodded, blinking fast. "You're going to New York?" "I haven't decided. You should. I want to go for me, not to prove anything." "You don't have to prove a thing." We sat a while longer. Then, cautiously, she asked, "Did you change your will?" "Yes." She didn't flinch. "For Emma and others." She looked down at her hands. "That's fair." "I wasn't punishing you," I said. "I was just prioritizing legacy over obligation." Her voice cracked when she said, "Thank you for being honest." "For the first time," I replied. "I feel like I can be." She reached over and gently touched my hand. Her fingers were cool, salt damp. We stayed that way for a long moment, two women not fixing the past but acknowledging it. Eventually she asked, "What will you do when we all go home?" "I'm not sure yet." "Right. Plant something out back. Take walks without explanation." She smiled. "And if you get bored?" "I'll learn how to stay bored without vanishing." She laughed softly at that, genuinely. We didn't speak again for the rest of the hour. The fog lifted slowly. The outline of the sea sharpened. The wind warmed. And everything, for once, felt clear without needing to be defined. I would send the envelope that afternoon, no ceremony. Just a signature and a stamp. A woman closing a chapter, not with anger, but with authorship. Because in the end, stories aren't always resolved by reconciliation. Sometimes they find peace in rebalancing. 2 days later, they were gone. Claire, Kevin, and Emma left just after breakfast, the car packed with sun hats, board games, and unopened bottles of wine Kevin's mother had insisted they bring. Claire hugged me for longer than usual. Not in apology, not in farewell, but in quiet acknowledgement. "Don't forget to send me a picture from New York," she said, smiling through the window as they pulled away. I stood on the gravel drive with my sweater draped over one arm, watching, until the car disappeared down the road, lined with scrub pine and soft sand. The porch behind me creaked with the movement of wind, and somewhere in the kitchen, the coffee pot let out one last sigh. It was the first time in years I had stood in a house, my house, without needing to ask where I belonged. I didn't clean right away. I didn't strip the beds or fold towels. I didn't rush to erase the evidence of other people. Instead, I walked to the back garden, where the soil was still loose from the storm earlier that week. A neighbor's cat sat curled on the fence, tail twitching lazily, watching me as I pushed open the gate. I knelt by the flower bed I'd been ignoring. Nothing had been planted there since I'd taken over the deed. But today, I pulled out the small paper packets from my pocket zinnias, basil, and one labeled simply wild mix, and began to work the soil with my bare hands. The earth was cool and smelled of salt and roots. I worked slowly, pressing each seed into place as if it were an idea I didn't want to lose. I'd lived too long in houses where nothing truly grew. This time, I would grow something that didn't need anyone's approval to bloom. When the last row was covered, I stood and wiped my palms on my skirt. The sky had cleared. The wind was slower, and the house waited behind me, its doors open, its silence no longer accusing, but companionable. Back inside, I made a simple lunch: bread, fruit, sharp cheese, and carried it to the patio. I ate while rereading the letter from the symposium. In New York, the final paragraph invited me to speak on a panel titled, "Stories Rewritten: Finding Your Voice After Silence." I didn't laugh, though it almost invited it. The symmetry of it all. After lunch, I walked through each room of the house slowly. The framed photograph of Claire as a girl had fallen slightly askew in the guest room. I straightened it, my fingers brushing the glass. A beach towel had been left on the floor of Emma's room. I folded it, pressed it flat. I moved through the space not as caretaker, not as tolerated company, but as the one who chose what stayed and what went. By mid-afternoon, I found myself standing at the bedroom closet. I opened the door and pulled out an old suitcase, the kind I hadn't used since my last conference, a lifetime ago, when I still traveled under a pseudonym and apologized for my voice before I used it. I placed it on the bed and opened it. The lining smelled faintly of lavender and ink. One dress, one sweater, a stack of books with dog-eared pages, my notebook, comfortable shoes. I packed slowly, deliberately. When I zipped the suitcase closed, I left it by the door. I spent the evening on the porch again, the sea now visible and wide beneath the settling dusk. The tide was low, and scattered figures walked the wet sand below, their silhouettes soft and unhurried. I thought about all the rooms I'd entered in my life. Classrooms, waiting rooms, dining rooms where I was invited but never really seen. And then I thought about this porch, the one I had bought quietly, not to prove a point, but to reclaim a shape I'd nearly forgotten I was allowed to take. I brought out my journal and wrote one last entry before the flight. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you decide to live into while you're still here. I closed the notebook. The sky deepened. The house behind me exhaled in its evening creaks and quiet. Tomorrow I would board a plane. I would speak on a stage where no one knew the version of me Claire had once tried to shrink. And that would be a different kind of story, one that began not with revenge but with rediscovery. And here, at the edge of that turning, I wasn't waiting for anyone's permission. I already had the keys.